Hi, I'm Steve Towns, Deputy Chief Content Officer for Government Technology. Welcome to our Q&A with Alexis Bonnell from Google Cloud. Alexis is the emerging technology evangelist for public sector at Google Cloud. She has more than 20 years of experience in management and communications, including serving as Chief Innovation Officer at the United States Agency for International Development and Chief of Applied Innovation and Acceleration in the organization's U.S. Global Development Lab. Alexis, welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. Today's topic is artificial intelligence, a technology that really found some practical use cases during the pandemic around helping agencies manage spiking workloads and getting help to people faster. Some of those experiences really put more attention on how governments can use AI going forward. So maybe first, let's talk about how AI can positively transform the way we work.
Yeah, absolutely. As you kind of framed for us, this last year has been incredible, right? Whether that was the amount of scale that we were talking about with particular programs, whether it was the pressure on our public servants to pivot, in light of different challenges, this idea of how can we be helpful? How can we supplement? How can technology make a difference, really in that day-to-day human experience? And I think for all of us around the world, the pandemic was certainly kind of the moment that came into question. And I think really what we've seen is a lot of different ways that public servants are using AI to help them do what they do better to meet that mission. I think one is this idea of really being able to transform kind of a citizen experience. AI can really help surface information, insights more rapidly and at scale. And what's really interesting is it can actually help government agencies translate maybe gov speak to people speak. One example that I love is that, sometimes you might be looking and it might be, form 2681 that you've got to find, Steve. That's kind of the gov speak. But really from a people speak standpoint, you might be looking for a fishing license, right? So one of the things that AI can do is really kind of build that connective tissue between how people speak, how they actually live their lives and look for information versus maybe how government has organized it. I think the other one that was really particularly meaningful for me is, and I'm sure you can relate to it, Steve, is the fact that, people are burnt out, and especially our public servants, right? They've been doing just heroes work over the last year and a half. And so I think one of the things I love is when I see them really harness AI just to make their lives easier, right? So whether that is, using AI to process finance or invoices, or using it to do research or to surface information, really this idea of public servants being able to be empowered to spend their time where they have the most value and quite often, honestly, enjoy the work the most versus maybe those elements that can be automated. I think the other thing that's really interesting is this idea of really using AI to bring in and provide insights or to do tasks that can relieve pressure on both skilled and unskilled workers. So for example, physical inspection, looking at programmatic or environmental changes over time. There's just so many ways that AI can and is kind of augmenting, right, what it is that we do with people to help us scale and to help us really put our focus toward value-driven work.
So it's really got the potential to kind of transform that work experience for our public sector workforce, and for this and on the public-facing side, transform experience for the folks consuming those services.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what a really interesting thing that I always love is this idea of when you think about AI, right? It's not technology for technology's sake. It should really be doing something to make people's lives easier, right? To make your staff more efficient, more effective, and happier, as well. If you can start with kind of that pain, what you're trying to solve, AI is often, the next person you want to invite to the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? It's like, oh, I want to be a part of this family.
Right. Another technology we saw, not that it was unknown before this, but really kind of gained attention in the government space is cloud. Do you want to talk a little bit about how AI can work in concert with cloud and maybe other new technologies to really drive digital government?
Yeah, what I've been really excited about, obviously, the last year again has really told us this idea of needing to have information agility, right? So whether we call it data, whether you just call it the info that you need to do your job, to make decisions, really this idea of cloud kind of maximizes or puts a racing engine, if you will, in kind of your information flow. And so, once you start to do that, once you really empower that information flow, then tools like AI can really complement it. But even, to back it up and to be really simple about it, if you think about it, for many of us, when we had questions, during the pandemic on any number of topics, the first thing someone might do is Google it, right? So that idea of Googling it, really being that digital front door, for public servants, thinking about if that's where someone starts, how might AI or the cloud kind of bring in that constituent, but ultimately start to serve them up the information they need. Another one that's really interesting is the idea of how, now that we're in these hybrid, kind of workplaces, sometimes in the office, maybe sometimes working at a distance, that, this idea of how do we actually integrate that information flow that cloud kind of puts on steroids and that AI can start to tap into productivity tools like Workspace. We saw a huge amount, Workspace or any other productivity tool. We saw a huge amount of public servants actually, kind of becoming technology solvers. They were using tools, low code, no code tools like AppSheet or API structures to actually just, again, move that information from their productivity tools like email or their storage, into more active interaction. I think, another one is being able to bring in things like sentiment, right? Really hear from your customers more, be able to bring in that data set. There's also bigger programs, for example, leveraging, geographic information, weather information. So long story short, obviously, Steve, I'm really excited about this. But the whole point is that, AI is really based on optimizing your information flow, right? Optimizing your decision structures. And so anything that we can do, to do that better, or any technology they already have in place, is usually kind of a basis for that. One thing I would add is that I think a lot of people kind of think that AI is something they have to start from scratch. And what's been so exciting is there have been so many developments by public servants around the world, that are tackling those issues that, are something that a lot of our public servants in government share, right? Whether that's state to state, or between countries. And so I think this idea of, you don't always have to start from scratch, right? You might be able to build on code or parser that we might use in AI language and actually recycle something that someone else has done to kind of get you there faster. So, one of the things I think that's really exciting is it's not just building on cloud, but it's actually building on other public servant or other government, agencies' work to actually help bring that kind of, that beauty, that simplicity to your own staff, to your own constituents.
So that is a great segue into the next question. What are some of the primary use cases for AI in government that you're seeing? And maybe there's some already kind of out there that others could leverage.
Oh goodness, there are so many. And actually what's really exciting is that I think as much as public servants have shown an appetite to embrace technology, right, to digitize their work, I think they even have a greater culture of sharing, right? And so I'll tell you a couple of things that have been exciting to me. I mean, obviously a huge amount of work around what we might call document AI, right? This idea of bringing in forms. Those could be handwritten forms. Those could be, crumpled tax receipts, whatever those are, W-2s, whatever those are, a lot of different government agencies work on some of these same documents, right? Or require them in their systems. And so actually being able to build on the work that's already been done and bringing in some of this information flow. Another great example is things like finance and procurement, right? Well, different groups might have slightly different processes. A lot of the core information, the formatting, the different types of things they bring in may actually be pretty similar. So, you may not get all the way from A to Z, but you might get from A to W, and that only leaves, a little bit to go. I think another one we're seeing is actually on research. So really using tools we have like Rad Labs and others to create environments where you can share data, you can add in AI, natural language processing and querying. A few other areas that really hit close to home, I think, are things like virtual career centers, right? So how we actually use AI to match people with jobs or interests, things like fraud detection, right? How are we making sure the best resources go where they're needed most? You know, and of course, things like CCAI, or what we call kind of call center AI, this idea of how do we really supplement, you know, what was a huge influx in inquiries and information needs from constituents around the world, and how did we help agencies really, you know, get the right information quickly to those who needed it, but most importantly, give time to those agents, you know, that really needed to spend time helping in unique cases, right? Or helping with constituents that had more complex issues than maybe changing a password, right? Or finding some basic information. So if you can't tell, there's no shortage of wonderful ways it's already been applied. And of course, we're excited to see all the ways it will be in the future.
Yeah, so tons of potential, tons of value. AI, I think, can still sound or seem intimidating to, especially to those that don't have any experience with it. But I know in some previous conversations, you've really kind of made the point that these tools are more accessible than you might expect. Can you give us a quick demonstration of what you mean and kind of show us?
Absolutely. So you're hitting on one of my favorite things, and that is that, you know, part of the reason why I came to Google, to be honest, as a public servant before, is I wanted to demystify these things, right? I was like, how does it work? You know, am I ever going to understand this? So I'm going to show you one of the tools that I really love, if that's okay. I'm going to walk you through just so I can take my camera back to show you this. So I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what I'm looking at, which right now, Steve, is you. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to Teachable Machines. So Steve, tell me when you can see that.
Yep, I see it.
Perfect. So this is a website that is not super secret. Alexis has access only. This is something that anyone that's watching this could go and play with. And what I will tell you is that if you get a chance to play with it, and if your kids see it, if they are within kind of computer navigation age, this will keep them busy all weekend because it's super cool. So I'm going to go ahead and click Get Started. And you'll notice that there's 3 different types of data, if you will, or information flow that you can actually program with this tool. So one is around images, one is audio, and one is movement or poses. So we're going to go ahead and just click an image. So what I'm doing, again, very basic, classic, straightforward Google structure, is what I'm going to be asking the computer to do is to kind of train a model. So the first thing I'm going to give it to recognize in this model, and I think I'm going to spell it wrong because I always do, is a pineapple. And yes, I'm a weird person that has a pineapple on my desk. So what you'll see is I'm literally, there's no data, right? So here you're seeing what it's going to process, and you have image samples on the right. So if I click hold to record, you'll see that all of a sudden, you know, all of these images of myself and a pineapple are showing up. And really what I'm doing with this is I'm feeding it data, right? So data doesn't always have to be in the form of documents or bits and bytes. In this case, data is a picture of a pineapple. So my second class, or the second thing, the class I'm comparing it to, we're going to call it a tumbler. And you're going to see, Steve, just how much soda is too much. So here's my tumbler, right? This is all, you know, I'm just kind of looking, getting it data. And again, what's really important to understand is Steve, did you see me tell it this is me versus this is my chair versus this is a tumbler?
No, not at all.
Right? That's pretty interesting so far.
Yeah.
Let's see what it does with it. So I'm going to click Train Model. Now, Steve, again, most importantly, did you see me write a single piece of code?
Nope.
Did you see me enter any ones or zeros?
Nope.
Did you see me make any algorithms?
Nope.
That's because I can't do any of those things, Steve. But you know what I can do is I can use this, and what I can do is I can start to ask myself, okay, what I really want out of an AI or ML model is I want accuracy in the prediction. So what you're seeing right now is that with the pineapple and the tumbler, it's trying to figure out, you know, what it's seeing. So I want you to watch the orange bar and the pink bar. So when, you know, I want it to recognize a pineapple in my data, did you see how it, now if I wanted to represent a tumbler,
Oh, super cool.
Isn't that cool? And so
Yeah.
there are a million fun ways you can do it. I like my tumbler and my pineapple. But what's really most important about this is to recognize that it's a little bit, and I'll go ahead and close out of this. Anyone can use this. I encourage everyone to, to participate. Yeah, and really, the point of that is that, I kind of equate it a little bit to almost how it was with websites, like
Yeah.
20 years ago, 15 years ago, it was like, I've got to have a special superhero kind of skill, right, to build a website. And then as that became more valuable, as more people realized it, then really what happened is it was made easier. And AI is very similar, right? That doesn't mean that you don't have exotic cases or things where you really want to have a lot of data scientists, and that makes sense. But it's also something that when you start to understand, it's taking data, you're training it, it's starting to help you identify that. It actually, often can be quite straightforward and easy to use.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess what we're seeing, right, is the technology is taking the complexity out of these tools and putting them, certainly in the hands of a lot more of us that can make these do useful things.
Absolutely. And I think that, that's really the point. What I think is so exciting about really the era that we're entering now in technology is technology should meet us, right, with what we know, how we function, and it should meet as much of us as possible and not force us to meet it, right? Because to be honest, Steve, if I had to become a data scientist or an engineer, like it would have never happened, right? But my ability to apply kind of my more mission-driven mentality to, right, the technology actually makes it really useful.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for showing us that. It's really fascinating how it works, and yeah, it could be really fun.
Well, I know you're spending your weekend on it after this. It's okay.
That's right. Luckily, we got some days off coming up.
Exactly.
That's what I'm going to do. Alexis, you've touched on this a little bit in some of our prior conversation, but let's talk a little bit about how this technology really helped governments, be agile and responsive during the pandemic. And, were there some really interesting applications you saw that would be good to share?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, what was really exciting was to see public servants, be both calculating, but also audacious, right, in the thought about this. So at a basic level, of course, in the pandemic, it was things like, how can we use AI to help us with data forecasting, vaccine distribution, even understanding whether a community was kind of comfortable with a vaccine or where they might need more information. I mean, those in itself were fundamental game changers, right, to our nation's ability to respond. But then also, I was so, I don't know, I guess you could just say like such a fan of so many different public servants that I saw and how they used it. So, one, of course, just a rock star, a guy named Chris at the state of Illinois, he really was so intentional about using AI to kind of help address, really soaring millions of unemployment insurance cases, right? Get people the right information. And he was really so smart about how he did it, right? Starting with, some of the basic frequently asked questions, testing things at night, but really being able to go from nothing to, to a lot of robust functionality in less than 2 weeks. Another one that I loved was, Rhode Island's Virtual Career Center, or Wisconsin's Virtual Career Center. They really, had this vision that it wasn't, simply enough to help someone in that moment of need. It was really helping them, get all the way back on their feet, connect with that, that next step. I think with Ohio, really seeing them be incredibly intentional about, making sure that they weren't putting out improper payments, right? Really making sure that those taxpayer dollars were going to the people who needed it most, right? And unfortunately, in a time of, a lot of resource shifting and a lot of resource availability, sometimes bad actors, really take advantage. And so, to see public servants be so conscientious about saying, how do we really, protect this investment by taxpayers in our nation? Also things, practical elements. So, Memphis did some really interesting work on pothole detection or blight. I saw the Navy do some really interesting work around detecting corrosion. So what I think I love more than anything is, just seeing these public servants step back and kind of say, how could I do what I do better, right? How could we, deliver this mission better? And those were a few of like a list of 100 of things that I'm just fascinated by.
I know we saw some just really impressive work, over the last year and a half or so under really trying circumstances. And, some of that is just so inspiring. I think coming out of the pandemic, I know there's a lot of now focus on modernization and given what, some of the challenges we had, and certainly some of the results around technology we saw, I think we're seeing a lot more maybe urgency around deploying some more modern technologies and capabilities. But at the same time, it's government. There are budget constraints. Do you want to talk about some cost-effective and simple ways you can start to integrate AI into what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. AI, I think in the last year has been used, in some ways almost incrementally, which really makes sense. This idea of how do we augment, and in some cases it might be the type of thing where public servants may not get the additional headcount that they need, right? So really thinking about how they help that, that headcount or those staff that they have be optimized, right? And what AI might do to supplement it. So, for example, I think also sometimes there's a perception that it's going to be much more expensive or it's going to take much longer than it actually does. And, one of the things that I loved was, the fact that a lot of public servants might be farther along the use of AI than they think. So for example, for many of us in public service, this idea of we already have frequently asked questions, right? We already have a great collection of information that we want to get to a constituent. Well, actually, that's a wonderful starting place for AI, right? So if you're thinking about call center AI, if you already have frequently asked questions, you can start, right, with a chatbot or a virtual agent, or a way for people to really find the most common answers to the most common questions and actually free up your staff's time to, again, focus on something that might be more complex. And I think the other thing that we'll see is that, really, I saw a lot of great models of public servants navigating risk, right? They were maybe a little nervous to use AI, or they had used it before and maybe hadn't got the results they wanted. So really that idea, and we try to help, our customers and partners when we do this, is think intentionally about how do you take those little steps, right? So that you're actually mitigating any perceived risk you have and, really kind of plotting out the right next step. And so I think long story short, AI is actually, especially as we're building on cases and things that public servants are doing around the world, usually not as expensive as someone expects. And usually something that actually creates value, right? By freeing up staff, by getting, more constituents answered quickly. And it's just been really exciting to see the appetite that public servants have to kind of figure out what it can do for them. Yeah.
So lots of ways to get started and kind of move incrementally and kind of see what works, sounds like.
Yep.
Any thoughts on what anybody listening in should think about as you kind of think about long term? Are there things to keep in mind to make sure that what you're doing now kind of serves you well, over the long haul?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things. I think really, ultimately what I know about, my experience in public servants is a lot of what, I was trying to do at any given time is take in the best information, that I could. Kind of information is almost the job of government, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. How do we take in information and how do we assign resources? And how do we refine that, right? So that the better information we have, the better we can assign those resources and ensuring that they're paying off, right? And they're providing the value that we want. So I think with that, understanding in some ways we're all kind of in this information business, right? It's not just Google that needs to be a data-first organization. And so I think also sometimes for public servants, we can feel like data is kind of this weird detached thing, right? But really it's what is the vibrant information that matters to your organization and how do you collect it as well as you can? How do you surface it, store it? And then how do you make it as agile as possible? So, you mentioned other investments in technology, whether that's, creating and moving things to the cloud so you have that agility, whether it is, being able to use things like APIs or others to actually move information between maybe partners you didn't have before or data sources you didn't benefit from before, right? So all of this idea, I think at the root of it though, for me is really a mentality shift And that is that, a lot of times when I was a public servant, I'd be looking at creating a technology and it would almost be like a moment in time, right? I'd be looking at the problem or the program I was trying to solve at that moment in time, the technology available, the partners available, and most importantly, the information available. And that made sense, right? That seemed like a really logical way to do it. But I think what we've learned over this last year and a half and beyond is that actually all of those factors are going to change. Right? I'm going to have different technology available 6 months from now than now. I'm going to have maybe different partners, maybe more robust information, right? Because I unlocked a lot of it that was stuck in documents or historical records. And so this idea of actually how do we move from kind of creating those systems that are trapped in a moment of time to actually making them intentionally living? Right? So kind of how do we create living systems that actually grow and change with us? And sometimes that's, really critical decisions. Like one could be, really approaching containerizing your data to make it as nimble and agile as possible. It could be using zero trust in order to make your movement of data more secure, but also, more vibrant. It could be, being able to do things like natural language querying, or being able to kind of use normal words and robust search to actually find the things that are in your systems. But I think the root of it is this idea that going into a technology moment with the intent that what you're trying to build is something that can change with you.
Alexis, really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much for being with us today. That is great insight around a really important technology.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much for helping public servants like I used to be kind of understand just a little more every day about all of the ways that tech can help us.
It's our pleasure.